This was not made for someone this tall. I can't even read what I'm saying here. Hold on. First of all, I'd like to thank Tom and ISI for putting this together. Tom has boundless energy. I don't know how he does it. This is probably the 18th program he's done in the last 2 weeks. It is an honor to be able to moderate this debate. I know Glenn and Susan very well, and I admire both of them. I'd like to just declare the winner now, if that's okay. No. All right. I did ask Glenn and Susan to send me just a little snapshot of what their position is going to be, just so that we can frame the debate. Glenn had written the following. The United States, along with much of Western civilization, is in bad shape. America's ruling class is indifferent or even hostile to our founding principles. A radical left-wing oligarchy pays lip service to Constitution's forms and procedures as a kind of political theater. The American people are increasingly alienated from both the opinions and the habits of self-government. An essentially open southern border is dissolving the very meaning of citizenship and national sovereignty. To speak of conserving the American regime is now unhelpful and even counterproductive. Our best path forward is to recall the revolutionary spirit of the founding generation, placing our hopes in the spiritedness inherent in human nature, and considering how the principles, if not the institutions, of Republican liberty can be prudently adapted to our challenging new circumstances. And so with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Glenn.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to ISI and Hillsdale. Thank you to Dr. Hanssen. I'm tempted to, and thank you for that little summary. I'll recapitulate just a little bit of that. I'm tempted to just start going down the list of everything that's wrong with America and all the violations of our rights. And I figure before I get too very long down that long list, I could simply declare that I've won the debate. I'm not going to do that, but I will mention just two things that happened just within the last week that indicate just how serious the problem is. I was on a podcast with a friend of mine who I won't mention about a year ago discussing the current situation, and this was when Loudoun County School Board, you may remember this, was at the sort of ground zero of the parental revolt against CRT. There had been an incident with a student being assaulted in a school bathroom by a transgender student, and the school board covered it up and lied to the parents. And my interlocutor on this podcast said, see, this is what's happening. You start messing with people's children and parents will rebel, and this was supposed to be the groundswell of the great parental revolt that was going to defeat the left and save the republic. And I was not very hopeful and did not share in this expectation. Well, it turns out there was an election last week, as you know, in many places in the country, including the school board in Loudoun County, Virginia. And what did the people of Loudoun County do after they were supposed to be ground zero of they elected 6 out of 9 leftists to the school board. So that's what happened to what was supposed to be the epicenter of the great parental revolt. They put 6 leftists out of the 9 positions on the school board there. Also last week, you may have seen that there was a manhunt by the FBI, including tanks, to track down a man named Gregory Yetman, who 2 years ago, on January 6th, sprayed pepper spray towards the Capitol Police. And when the FBI came, he performed the amazing, unexpected maneuver of running out his back door, completely surprising our crack FBI team, who then engaged in this massive manhunt, including tanks. I think, I'll just stop there and say, it seems to me, if you just look at what's going on, my argument would be, as Khalil said, the idea of conserving is no longer helpful, and that we should think in terms of being revolutionary. Let me emphasize here, I do not mean by that violence. In fact, not only am I not encouraging violence because I don't want to wind up in the same jail as the January 6th prisoners, I would encourage everyone on the right emphatically not to engage in violence, because that's exactly what the regime would like. They would like nothing more than an excuse to crack down. I'm going to mention one more thing about our current situation, and then I want to move on and just slightly reframe our debate, which I think will give it a little bit more clarity. The other thing I would mention about our current situation in addition to all the grievances and the violations of our rights, which I think are very meaningful, a lot of us on the right have a tendency to look at the Declaration these days and notice with some amazement and consternation how many of the grievances listed in the Declaration are very apt and seem to be quite applicable to our own situation. And as important as those are, I would add one more. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the founding era may recall that from around some point in 1775 to 1776, a real dramatic shift happened. In 75, Jefferson writes the Summary Review of the Rights of British Americans and is still talking in the language of English rights and English subjects. And a decisive shift occurs by the time you get to the Declaration of Independence, and they start speaking not of their English rights, but of their natural rights, and not of themselves as British colonists, but as Americans. And so it's a question not only of the violation of rights, although that's important, but also this question of being a separate people. And I think that's underappreciated today. Red and blue Americans are separate people. We are separate people occupying the same nation. And it seems to me that this is a salient fact, which also goes to thinking in a more radical, more revolutionary way about the situation we have. In a way, I would say that our divisions are even greater than those that separate. What separated Americans from the British across the sea were not nearly as fundamental in terms of basic metaphysical and philosophical and theological questions. We can't even agree today, never mind questions of justice and the purpose of government, we can't even agree today on nature and human nature and whether it's possible to simply turn little boys into little girls with hormone therapy and surgery. There are no more fundamental differences that I can think of. And so we really are two people occupying a similar nation. Let me, pardon me, let me turn now to just reframe the debate in a little way that I think will be helpful. Dr. Hanssen is not a crazy leftist. This is, of course, Hillsdale College, which means the Overton window of what we all agree on is sort of over here. And so whatever empirical differences we have might not be very helpful. You know, I might think things are a little worse and she thinks they're not quite that as bad, and that doesn't really resolve anything. Aristotle pointed out that practical wisdom is harder than theoretical wisdom because intelligent, thoughtful, prudent people can come to different judgments about any given empirical situation. And so that doesn't get us very far. So I want to propose reframing the debate slightly with the following formulation. And in all the commentary on our current situation, I think I'm the first to propose this way of looking at it. And so I would offer a way of looking at this that offers us a dichotomy, that runs a clear line through these empirical differences. And that turns on the question of whether time is on our side. The answer to that will then tell you whether we should take a more meliorist position or a more revolutionary position. So what do I mean by this? So in the first instance, people with a conservative temperament, people who are disposed to be conservative in a sort of small c way, are always inclined to take a wait-and-see attitude and to emphasize that the unknown always has the danger of being worse than the current situation. And so recklessness is to be discouraged. But we forget that there's another side to that, and that foot-dragging and dithering can also present dangers. And this actually came up during the Revolution. I happened to be looking at the history of the Revolution written by Mercy Otis Warren. And in describing the debates leading up to the Declaration, quotes Richard Henry Lee, the prominent delegate from Virginia, who emphasized, the danger of delay. Delay presents its own dangers. I'll also just mention, since I only have a few minutes left, Lincoln and Madison pointed out the importance of veneration for the laws and the veneration that time bestows on the Constitution. The longer things last, the more respectable they come. And so we respect the Constitution because not only because of its stability and the veneration that time bestows, and that was an important thing for cultivating respect for the Constitution. But again, this has a flip side. It's not only good constitutionalism that earns the veneration that time bestows, but also bad constitutions and bad regimes. And bad regimes also cultivate the veneration of time. And I think this is an important aspect that we ought not to forget. The longer this unconstitutional and anti-constitutional regime that we seem to have persists, the more it becomes acceptable. And so I would reframe this question, is time on our side? And my answer, of course, is that it's no. If you think, like me, that the longer the regime stays in power, the more legitimate it becomes for the American people, the longer we allow the militarizing and politicization of the Justice Department or the blatant partisanship of the national security apparatus to remain in place, the more it becomes regarded as something we simply have to live with. The longer we accept this unholy alliance of public-private censorship regime, or the two-tier justice department, which I think, a two-tier justice system, which I think is increasingly evident, the more we encourage the American people to accept all of this as normal. And the harder, therefore, it will be to rouse them to action. The harder it will be to persuade them that this is and must be regarded as unacceptable, as antithetical to constitutional self-government. And so I would end by saying, if you agree with me that time is not on our side, then our attitude and our rhetoric and our thinking can no longer be conservative. It must be revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. And so just as I had asked Glenn to send me a brief précis on his position, I asked Dr. Hanssen as well, and she writes the following. The United States is the healthiest part of Christian civilization at the moment. The habits of self-government remain stronger in the United States than in the EU, and an entrepreneurial and philanthropic culture still pervades American local communities. American resistance to the COVID lockdown by businesses, local religious communities, and indeed whole states far surpassed the spiritedness of other countries. America's elite ruling class have been hostile to our constitutional regime and underlying moral culture for over 100 years. What is new and heartening is the growing awareness of this predicament. The patriotic language of conserving is not merely the most rhetorically effective, make America great again, not regime change, but morally imperative. The tools we have for engaging our current crisis have been forged and redefined by generations of American countercultural culture warriors. Conservatism is not a strategic posture, but a necessary political disposition to reject utopian expectations and to draft our efforts onto the work of previous generations. And so with that, we'll have Dr. Hanssen.
So Professor Ellmers is here on his somewhat home territory. I think he teaches here when he's not out at Claremont. But I'm a damn foreigner. And if I had known, I'm not from around here, if I had known that this was the beginning of the hunting season, I would have rejected this date for the debate. But I think we have a good turnout nevertheless. And thank you all very much for coming out. And I wanted to reiterate a thank you to Tom Saruf. You said that he has more energy than anyone you know. He was in San Francisco yesterday and in Taiwan the day before. So yes, he has enormous amounts of energy to kind of keep these conversations going among college students all over the country and indeed internationally. So I wanted to begin with a famous line from G.K. Chesterton, my first love, G.K. Chesterton. He says, "A true patriot does not fight because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves, dearly loves, what is behind him." Patriotism is a virtue. Conservatives must be patriots as a moral imperative. And patriots must be conservatives. You cannot be a patriot and say that there's nothing valuable about your own national, cultural, or political heritage. The question of today's debate, what is there left to conserve, and whether we should abandon the language of conservatism for the language of revolution, I think has to be considered in the context of patriotism. I agree with Professor Ellmers on a lot. I agree particularly on his eloquent portrayal, his vibrant portrayal of the twin hijacking of America. The hijacking of our political regime by an elite oligarchy, and the hijacking of our general culture with a kind of moral decadence, right? A moral decadence that did not begin yesterday, and a hijacking of our political regime that did not begin yesterday. And so I want to talk a little bit about when did it happen? I'm a historian, not a political philosopher. I'm a historian, not a philosopher. I'm a historian, not a theologian. So the question of when and how long we've been living under this new regime that is not the founders' regime is an important question. It did not happen when the deep state installed its puppet, Biden. It did not happen under Obama. I don't know if any of you remember the kind of eschatological, apocalyptic language that we talked about Obama's presidency. It did not happen with the Clinton machine. I don't know if you remember, random suicides and horrible things happening in the Oval Office that made us think that this was the end of our regime. It did not happen in the 1960s. And I think that Professor Ellmers would agree with me that we have been living not under the founders' regime, but under a different regime for at least 100 years. I think that, at the very least, we'd have to go back to Woodrow Wilson, right? At the very least, we'd have to look at the 1920s presidency of Woodrow Wilson, when the progressives gave us an internationalist foreign policy that had very little to do with American national interest, a welfare system presided over by an unelected bureaucracy, and a left-wing activist Supreme Court fed by the newly minted progressive law schools. But I think it goes back even further than that. I may think we need the language of conservatism, but I'm not an optimist about our current moment. I absolutely agree that we are in a crisis of our regime. But how long have we been in this crisis of our regime? I think it goes back further to the injection of Hegelian ideas into the American mind in the mid-19th century, back with the transcendentalists of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, with the beginnings of graduate schools, graduate programs with PhDs who had gotten their degrees over in Germany, with the replacement of a belief in God with a belief in progress, a belief in time, as if time itself is a force to be reckoned with. It has replaced the belief in God with a belief in progress. Hegel particularly saw progress as moving forward through revolution. The process of creating the great Das State would go forward through revolution. The revolution of social classes, as Marx, that great Hegelian, said, right? A revolution of a thesis and its complete opposite clashing with each other, the thesis clashing with the antithesis, and then the clash of the thesis and the antithesis producing, at long last, the synthesis, the utopia, the perfect political regime in time. And that's what we're living to expect in our post-Hegelian world, right? And if we don't have a perfect regime, we think it's time for another revolution. We can't use the word revolution in the 21st century in the way that the word revolution was used by the founding fathers in the 18th century. The word has been hijacked. In fact, the hijacking of the word revolution predates the hijacking of our political regime. The rhetorical struggle comes first. The political battle comes after that. The abuse of language is the abuse of power, as Joseph Pieper, who spent time in a Nazi prison, has told us in his wonderful little book, Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. When once we gave up the perfectly clear and descriptive word sodomy for violent, perverse, and self-degrading act. We cleared the way for redefining marriage itself, and then erasing the difference between men and women, and he and she, and enforcing a new regime of pronouns on all of us. I agree that our regime has been hijacked and that our culture is debased. But we have, in fact, been living under this for a very long time. Alistair McIntyre, at the end of his book, After Virtue in 1981, compared 1981. So at least much longer than your lifetime, we've been in a crisis of our regime, right? A civilizational crisis. 1981, Alistair McIntyre captured people's imagination with his book After Virtue, and particularly with the final paragraph in which he compared our situation today to the end of the Roman Empire. And he said, the difference is that the barbarians have been ruling us for quite some time, and the fact that we are unaware of this is a large part of our predicament. I would argue that the deep state's COVID lockdown, which was a preemptive rigging of the election, a desperation move of a regime that had been long settled and well established and thought they had everything under control in both parties. I would argue that the deep state's COVID lockdown, which rigged the election of 2020, had unintended consequences. Consequences not intended by those who created the pandemic for us. Political consequences and cultural consequences. I think that they awoke the American people. I think that more people today than people in 2010, and more people today than in the year 2000, more people today than in 1990, and more people today than in 1980 are aware that our government has been taken over. The deep state rejection of Donald Trump was not a coup d'etat. It was a revelation of a coup d'etat that had happened long ago. But revelation of the truth is a good thing. We cannot use the word revolution without the connotations of the confiscation of property, the dissolution of all of the churches, and the redefinition of marriage, a connotation for the word revolution that was acquired with the French Revolution and deepened even more with the Bolshevik Russian Revolution. I would go back to G.K. Chesterton in closing. Patriots must be conservatives. A true soldier does not fight because he hates what is in front of him. He fights because he loves, dearly loves, what is behind him. Thank you.
Yeah. You want to do the questions from up here? Oh, the rebuttal, that's right. Sorry. You guys
Thank you, Dr. Hanssen. I'm not exactly sure entirely how to respond. So there was, Dr. Hanssen spoke quite a bit about how this has been going on for a long time, and I agree. I'm not exactly sure how that's quite a refutation. If you take your car into the shop and the mechanic says, you had an oil leak for a long time, I would not draw the inference from that, oh, well, then everything's fine. I don't need to do anything serious. Just because something has been going on for a long time doesn't mean it can persist for a long time. It may mean that you are now at the moment where your car will stop running if you don't immediately fix the problem. And I think that's where we are. So yes, I agree it's been going on for a long time, and I think it's been getting noticeably worse. I think the deep state has become immeasurably more aggressive, more hostile, more overt. The politicization that's happened and the militarization that's happened with the Justice Department, I think, has no precedent. And so I'm not sure that the argument that it's been going on for a long time quite refutes my position. I'm sympathetic to the argument about revolution being a kind of a toxic word. You know, look, I come from the Claremont Institute, and we've spent 40 years trying to teach the proper understanding of the language in the Declaration of Independence. And one of my arguments is, yes, the left has totally misrepresented what equality means. Well, that doesn't mean we should give up on it. It means we should fight and keep the word and explain, because they've also abused the words freedom and they've abused the words law. And if we simply acquiesce in giving up the definition of words to the other side, we'll be left with nothing to talk about. And so I don't agree with simply relinquishing any words to the left because they misrepresent what they mean. And I think revolution is a perfectly valid word, and I want to hold on to it. But if it makes you feel better, I sometimes use the word radical, and I tell my students that the root of the word radical in Latin comes from the word root, and to be radical means to go back to the root, to first principles. And I'm happy to say that instead of being conservative, we should be radical, if that helps. But I think my point remains the same, that to speak of conserving today is not helpful, and that we need to be radical revolutionaries or some other word of your choice.
Thank you. You said that you don't want to give up a perfectly good word like revolution, because we don't want to start giving up perfectly good words like equality and excellent words like freedom and liberty. And I think that's a very good point. My problem is I don't want to give up the word America. And if we switch from conservatism to revolution, then what happens to America? It's a very difficult, possibly self-contradictory position to take, that the American regime of the founders is dead, therefore viva the American Revolution. It's not possible for us to understand what is happening to us with the clarity that we are able to understand what is happening to us if we haven't been taught those principles down through the ages, right? There have been both destruction of our regime, and in every generation, there has been a small cadre, a small remnant. Remnant is a favorite word of Russell Kirk. Remnant is a favorite word of Russell Kirk in his chapter on what Americans get from Jerusalem. The idea of being a remnant, a small remnant. In every generation, there has been a remnant that has become more clear-eyed about what has been happening to us and passed on that clarity to the next generation. And maybe Loudoun County Public Schools ain't going to do the trick, and we're going to have to homeschool our kids, right? Viva la homeschool. Hashtag defund the universities. Hashtag homeschool. So you may be right there. The battle for the public schools, but I'm still banking on Tennessee, right? I mean, Tennessee wants to pull out from federal funding for their schools and take back the schools for the parents. Maybe something good is around the corner. The point is that none of us have any idea how much time we have, and none of us have any idea how much time the American regime has. But the American regime does have a vocation, and we are Americans, and we have to be actively engaged in helping America as a nation to fulfill its role. Personally, I think one of those roles is bringing together a unity of Christians, bringing together Catholics and evangelicals and the Orthodox. There's been a lot done in the 20th century in terms of the development of an understanding of natural law and the basis of the moral law that Russell Kirk also writes about so well in his chapter on Jerusalem, in his Roots of the American Order, so that we all understand more and more clearly what we have in common to fight for, what it is that we have in common that we dearly love and that we would fight for. Thank you.
Well, please give a round of applause for our two debaters. Is this microphone on? Can you hear me? Oh, here it's on. Okay. So my task now as moderator is to ask both of our guests some questions. And most of these questions really are designed to also help stimulate some questions on your part as well. So there will be a Q&A of the audience after. So I'm going to go backwards, actually, if it's okay. I'm going to start with Susan. Susan, it seems to me, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of what their disagreement is, because we want to debate, we agree on way too much. That's boring. I want to know where are the fault lines, where the people differ here. And so, Susan, it seems to me that your position ignores Glenn's real challenge, and that is How can you invoke patriotism as a means toward reviving conservatism when patriotism today would mean being patriotic to a regime that has centralized authority, weaponized institutions, the law, has essentially turned most citizens into subjects? Who would want to be patriotic to such a regime? So how would you challenge Glenn back or address that question of conserving the current regime isn't really patriotism, it would be a suicide mission?
Yes, it is on. Again, I think there's a lot of truth in that formulation of our situation. I do think that our regime itself, the constitutional regime itself, underlying, right, gives the people the tools that they need to fight back. And I know that I'm a little bit of a strange pro-lifer because I was actually charmed with Dobbs. I know there are a lot of pro-life people who thought that Dobbs didn't go far enough, and if it's human, then call it a human, and if it's homicide, call it homicide. And so they think that it didn't go far enough. I think I'm a little bit of a strange pro-lifer because I just found reading the text just incredibly enjoyable and charming to sort of watch Sam Alito go. And to watch Sam Alito go was to watch the United States Supreme Court, after 30 years, berating itself for overstepping its constitutional boundaries and doing what the legislature should do. Now, there are two ways we can look at what just happened to our executive branch in the past 4 years, right? On the one hand, we can be aghast at what the deep state did to Trump. On the other hand, we can be incredibly amazed at what Trump initially accomplished in getting voters out of the woodwork who had never voted before. Is that going to give us a clear election? No. But still, it was an amazing accomplishment. He showed us something that can be done, right? And I do think that Trump has sufficient righteous anger, and perhaps some of it is grounded in personal righteous anger, but I think he might be the only person in America today who has sufficient righteous anger to do to the executive branch and the vast executive bureaucracy, which rules us by executive fiat, as we discovered during the lockdowns, and that nothing goes through the rule of law, nothing goes through the highest law of the land, the Capitol dome that stands above every building in Washington, D.C. Right? The legislature doesn't pass leges, right? That it's all going through the executive bureaucracy. If there's anyone who is angry enough at the unelected executive bureaucracy who could do something about it, I think it could be Trump. Now, I hope that Trump would also have the moderation to use the American Constitution of the founders, to use the separation of powers, the checks and balances, that he would conserve those. Right? That would be the American, that would be the patriotic way forward.
Related to that is a question for Glenn. Let's just say that is the way forward. In one of your pieces that I recently read and what you've indicated here is the separation of powers is broken. The Supreme Court is broken. Basically, all of the branches of government are broken. So let me ask you specifically then, one, how would you respond to Susan? And two, what radical measures specifically are you willing to put out there as a means to recover liberty?
Yeah. So again, I'm more interested in suggesting that we think and use rhetoric that is radical and revolutionary. I'm emphatically not promoting anything violent. And I think, if Trump could get elected, certainly there's a lot he can do within the system. I think we should be cognizant of the fact, though, that you don't even have to talk about stealing the election. Molly Hemingway wrote a great book that the election was overturned through strictly legal means. It's perfectly clear now that the deep state will obstruct and delay, and Trump only has one more term in any event. And so it's highly questionable how much he could even do within constitutional means. And so again, I'm not so much proposing specific measures as suggesting that the conservation of our institutions as if the status quo is in any way acceptable is the wrong way to think about things. Allow me to add one more point about this disposition people have, is to say, we'll get them next time, right? So, you know, the Mueller investigation, all sorts of things impeded Trump's first term, and a lot of people said, well, you know, we'll get things done in the second term. Well, the second term didn't happen. Biden was elected. And then we said, well, you know, the midterm, remember the red wave? Everything depended on the red. We were going to take control of Congress, and we were going to push back at this doddering old president, and the red wave petered out. And so we keep saying next time, next time, next time, and it seems to me that at some point we have to stop talking about next time and accept the fact that we're being, like the proverbial frog, we're being slowly boiled alive, and we've got to jump out of the pot at some point.
So Glenn, this raises another question though. In your remarks, you had mentioned that the family indignation that some people placed a lot of hopes in backfired. And the FBI, as you said, were overzealous, you know, with somebody with pepper spray. It seems like the real problem is twofold. You've got the centralization of government that you fear, but also just the complacent nature of conservatives. Where the hell are they? Are they a problem? How would you appeal to those who actually disagree with you entirely? And I'm talking about conservatives who claim there is no crisis, there is no constitutional crisis, Con Inc., or whatever they call these people. Are they a problem? And if so, how do you nudge them forward in your vision?
Yeah, in a way, they're the bigger problem, right? Because they have a lot of credibility, and you can point to people who've been conservative for a long time and, well, you know, if so-and-so doesn't think there's a problem, how, you know. I happen to be looking up, there's something called the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, and I think there are people who cannot accept even the possibility cannot even contemplate the very idea that the original constitutional regime is in a state of terminal illness. And in the Kubler-Ross, the first stage is denial. And I think a lot of people are still stuck in denial. And until they get past that, we won't get to the other stages of acceptance and then doing something about it. How, you know, I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a professor. But in their acceptance, in their unwillingness to accept things, the great danger is that things will have to get worse. And unfortunately, that may be the only thing that rouses people into accepting reality.
Susan, you had invoked G.K. Chesterton, and in an article that you had written, and in some of your remarks you had alluded to this, patriotism for him, I think to quote you directly, was rootedness, and in England. But England today, because of demographic shifts, is unrecognizable. How far would you be willing to go to restore Chesterton's view that patriotism begins with rootedness if so much of our immigration policy is diluting the character of the country in such large waves of immigration and now, I'm sure, refugees? How do you expect to revive patriotism when you don't really have Americans coming across the border?
I think that's an excellent question. I also wanted to respond a little bit to something that you were saying. If I can remember it, my brain is starting to shut down, and I need to save some juice for responding to questions from the audience. But G.K. Chesterton's idea of patriotism is that it's a love of our patria. It is a love of our fatherland and our mother tongue. It's not just a love for a regime, and it makes you fight for your country even when your regime is in terminal decline, right? So giving people a sense of place and giving people a sense of culture is something that is a project for a conservative. Right? There really is no other way of going about this. You can neither conserve a democratic republic nor revolutionize back to or revolutionize forward to a democratic republic without creating a morally healthy people, because the people's consent is necessary for a democratic republic, right? And so you have to conserve what you have and then reseed it right? Reseed it in both ways. You have to win converts, right, to the value of that culture, right? And you have to be constructive. You have to build culture in your own communities, in your own families. And I don't think that that's completely done. As I say, I think that both Chesterton and Russell Kirk very much have this idea of a remnant. And a remnant is very powerful, right? Because the truth, there is only the truth. The truth is the truth, and the truth is powerful. And so when you speak the truth, right, people can hear. Maybe they won't respond immediately, right? But you have sown a seed that they can hear later on in their life, right? And time may not be on our side, and we might be dead, right, before we see the fruits of that. But I remember talking to Joseph Pearce, a great G.K. Chesterton scholar in England back in the 90s, and he was quite insistent that the English were still hobbits, that fundamentally the English are still the hobbits of the Shire, right, who love elevenses and 5 o'clock tea and luncheon and supper. And I said, I don't see it. I live in London. I'm taking the tube every day. They look like, metropolitan metrosexuals to me. Sorry, but I'm just not seeing it. But I remember thinking, to each his own patriotism. To each his own patriotism. I know that foreigners coming to America wouldn't think that Americans have it in them, but I still believe that there are a sufficient number of Americans out there, right, that we can do this. And Pearce was proven right during the Brexit vote. And I think that our hope in the American people was proven right by the Trump election of 2016. And man, it sure got them really riled up.
There is a point that you both are really in agreement on that is not explicit. I want to make it explicit and then see where you guys, again, might differ. And that is, there's a real disconnect between politics and the people. On the immigration issue, like in England, it's obvious that the rise of populism really was sparked by immigration. And you can see sort of Trump imitators rising all over Europe, and there's some kind of populism. And that clearly shows that the citizens are completely at odds with those who are making political decisions for them. And Glenn had already spoken about that being the case here. So the question for both of you, since you both seem to have that in common, is what is the root cause of that? And how do you fix it? I mean, it seems, because one of the points that you've brought up in a lot of your writings, Glenn, is just restoring just the consent of the governed. I mean, it's like Washington is its own planet, calling it their own shots, often unconstitutionally, rarely in the national interest. America First was a controversial phrase. Why and to whom? So you both seem to share this view that there's been a disconnect between the people, who seem to have more common sense than those who rule over them. What is the root cause, and how do you get over it?
I mean, that's really just the growth of the administrative state, right? I mean, the problem we're facing is that instead of the government reflecting the will of the people, we've had a project underway for a long time to make the people reflect the will of the government. And that project is well underway. And it occurs in part through the indoctrination and the propagandization and censorship and lying and other things of the healthy part of America, and the importation of vast numbers of new Americans who are admitted in a way and shaped in a way and incentivized in a way to support the ruling class oligarchy. And so this project of making the people conform to the will of the ruling class proceeds apace. And this, I think, confirms my argument that time is not on our side. It's been happening for a long time, and if it goes on much longer, there won't be any turning back.
So if it's the administrative state, then what? What specifically would you call for? I mean, it doesn't have to be a revolution, doesn't have to be violent, but what if you were president, or if you're advising a president, what are steps one could take?
Well, there are things, I mean, I don't know if anyone's heard of Schedule F. We have, 2 million civilian employees in the federal government. There are laws in the books that prevent them from being fired. Trump proposed something called Schedule F, which would give the president more authority over these people who supposedly work for the executive branch. You can do other things. People have talked about breaking up the federal government and sending it around to different parts of the country. I actually don't support that idea because it simply spreads the contamination around. I'd be in favor of building a gigantic warehouse at the northernmost part of Alaska, and every obstreperous appointee, executive branch person who comes before Congress and is not cooperative gets sent to the warehouse in Alaska if you can't fire them. So there are things you can do. You need a strong majority in Congress, much better than the one we have. I mean, there are things you can do within the system, but you know, it's an uphill battle all the way.
If I could say just another word about immigration. When you look back across the history of the United States, we have always had an incredible amount of national diversity or ethnic diversity. And I think that, I mean, we don't realize this because it's not of the scale that we're used to right at the end of the 20th century. But when the Scots came over in the 1700s, the English saw them as horrific barbarians, right, who didn't live under English common law and couldn't be trusted with a weapon and therefore can't be in the militia. And it was a big deal when George Washington allowed them to be in the Continental Army. The Irish came in, completely different, right? Completely different. They were Catholic. They were, seen as complete foreigners. In fact, they were called the Black Irish, right? They were so foreign. And then, of course, as soon as you start having people coming over from Italy and Poland and Russian Jews, the Irish suddenly look so similar to the English and the Scottish because they're at least English-speaking. They might be Roman Catholic, but they're at least English-speaking, right? Now that we've got Poles and Italians and Puerto Ricans. And so I do think that, we have one major problem in terms of a sense of rootedness, a sense of a populism that can genuinely be a populism that is not racial, and that is that we emphasize our Christian character. African Americans in this country are not a minority. They belong to the Protestant majority. They belong to the Protestant supermajority. African Americans are more likely to self-identify as Christian than quote-unquote white people, right? So if we were to create a new evangelical awakening that had, genuine fervor behind it, right? We could also have a new awakening of populist patriotism, right? And I think you see inklings of that. I think you see inklings of that in the Hispanic community. I think you see inklings of that in the African American community. We do have a problem, right? It's not the African Americans' fault that they're mostly metropolitan and urban and therefore deracinated. That is a historic problem that we as Americans have to figure out what to do with, right? As Thomas Jefferson said, I fear for my country when I remember that God is just and his justice does not live forever. That is something that we as conservatives and we as patriots have to think through.
So we have one question left for each, and we have to end on a good note. I mean, otherwise it'll be a very depressing debate. So if each of you could just give one point of optimism, some advice that you would give to these young students. If there was a national project you would want them to get behind that could help. I can see in your case maybe overturning Everson or something. But how would you inspire the generation that is here and elsewhere to move forward in your vision?
There is still a segment of the American people that is spirited and patriotic to the older Constitution and willing to fight. I don't know how big it is. It's certainly shrinking all the time. But my friend John Marini, whom some of you may know, an old Claremont guy, one of the great underappreciated political scientists in America, points out that the progressive takeover of the educational institutions has been going on for 100 years. The first attempt by the deep state to successful attempt to overthrow a president happened in Watergate in 1973. That was 50 years ago. And during all of this time, a substantial part of the American people have refused to acquiesce. They have refused to acquiesce in the administrative state's takeover and reformulation of the Constitution, and still resist. And that is impressive and a cause for hope.
Thank you. Susan.
I would just encourage young people to help forge a healthy marriage culture. When I got off the plane in the Detroit airport, I knew I was in Detroit and not in Texas anymore, because the first two things I saw were a woman wearing an LGBT rainbow-colored T-shirt and a woman wearing a burqa. I said, oh, I guess those are the only two kinds of women in the world nowadays, transgender women and women who wear burqas. Create a marriage culture, right? A marriage culture, a healthy family with children and grandchildren, with cousins and siblings, with aunts and uncles, getting together, playing music together, listening to stories together. Right? This will draw in anyone else who has not lived with that kind of rootedness. We're rooted primarily in family and faith before we're even rooted in soil, right? And so if we can at least be rooted in our family and in our faith, I think that the rootedness in soil might come back.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for our debaters, please. Now, Tommy, we will take some questions now from the audience. Let's get as many as we can.
Yeah, so if you have a question, just come on up here and we'll form a line down along this aisle. We have plenty of time for audience questions. I'm going to give a student the first question, if that's all right.
All right. In the words of Russell Kirk, the American Revolution was a revolution not made, but prevented. Any attempt to reestablish the founding would require us to overturn what might be termed the progressive revolution. Is that still possible?
Yeah, that's the big question. Trump tried. The first president to do this in a way, as I mentioned a moment ago, was Richard Nixon. He campaigned in his reelection on decentralization and getting the executive to bring back authority over the central government. And the deep state drove him out. And Trump is, in a way, the Act Two of Watergate. Whether that will succeed or not is the question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think the next decade will decide whether the American experiment lasts or will have proven to be have come to an end.
I think that we need to incorporate Trump into our pantheon of heroes, right? I think we've got a division right now in the conservative movement, right? Of those who are so pro-Trump that they want to debunk all earlier conservatives as not being sufficiently, I was going to say woke, but awakened, right, to the deepness of the deep state, right? And it's even reached its fingers into their own institutions, right? And then those who admire Nixon and what he achieved in an attempt at a counter-revolution, right? And admired Ronald Reagan and what he achieved in an attempt of counter-revolution, right? And I think we need to get together and admire Trump for what he accomplished in attempting a counter-revolution against the deep state. And we need to, we really need to come together on that. I mean, Nixon, 1974, we started having, in the midst of the Vietnam War protests, we started having outdoor 4th of July fireworks celebrations on the Charles River again, playing the great anti-revolution symphony of all time, the 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky, which had been banned by the Bolsheviks in Russia, right? And we started playing it for ourselves in the 1970s, right? That's awesome, right? And Ronald Reagan gave us pride again, right, after the hostage crisis. And so, we have to be able to recognize those things. There can't be this attitude of burn it all down. And I think there's a kind of ingratitude to just refer to it all dismissively as just conservative ink. I think we have to we have to do a better job of our own history as a movement.
Dr. Ellmers, you recommend that we have a revolutionary mindset. What does that look like as compared to being conservative?
It simply means recognizing that all of our institutions, not simply within the government, but certainly in popular culture, in the media, in the academy, that's been going on for a long time, but it's getting progressively worse. And now the corporate world has been taken over by the DEI ideologues, and increasingly the military. And if you recognize that our institutions in and out of government are now in control of those people hostile to constitutional self-government, it means that conserving, simply as a mindset, holding on to the status quo, is suicide. And that rather than hold on to the status quo, we need radical, revolutionary efforts to take back those institutions and to take back self-government. And so it's simply an outlook and a way of framing the argument and framing the rhetoric. Do we want to hold on, or do we need radical measures to take things back and recover our liberty?
So I think conservatism can sometimes seem very unglamorous. And I don't have a lot of experience of politics. I'm just an academic. But I do have experience of academic politics. And so I'll just share with you a couple of experiences from academic politics, not just my own, but historically. John Quincy Adams and his grandson Henry Adams at Harvard in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. There have been Adamses at Harvard throughout the entire 19th century. So what I've noticed is whenever you push for reform, academic reform, because you want to improve the core curriculum and make it better, they cut out classes that were most essential to the student's education. Budgetary measure cuts. Every time you think you can achieve radical reform, you lose one of your previous bases of operation. John Quincy Adams was insistent that Harvard needed to improve the study of Latin and Greek. And all he managed to accomplish with his reform committee was the abolition of Latin and Greek as prerequisites for getting into Harvard. So I just think that, don't think that conservatism is an unglamorous mindset, holding on to your basis. Sometimes you need to seize the high ground, if you see it, right? But sometimes you do need to dig trenches and stay huddled down there. As actually I think both the Ukrainians and Hamas are showing us that digging down underneath and staying put can actually be highly effective, even at people who have better weapons than you.
So I think there's a clear disagreement between you two that whether we have a little bit of time or a lot of time to sort of accomplish our aims. But one thing that you both, that seems to be a meeting point of both of the things you've been talking about, is that we've lost the principles of the founding in our current day. And it seems to me that there's an overlap between a return to that being a kind of revolutionary idea, since it is a change from what we're currently doing, and something that is already there and has been preserved over time. So would you both agree that the key in the rhetoric is saying what we have right now is not what we found in the founding? The principles are not being upheld, and we need to change to that, because those were true principles that have at least been kept for us, whether we're practicing them or not.
Yeah, I would. I mean, that's why, if we want the original American Constitution, we have to kick out what we have now and get it back, because it's not there. So that's my whole argument for thinking as a revolutionary, not as a conservative. I don't know how you would answer that.
There might be some point of deeper disagreement philosophically, but I think we would have to talk a lot longer in order to really tease that out and see if it's actually there or not on this issue of time, and time being on our side, and whether time is on our side or whether time isn't on our side, and what time of day is it. Because that kind of talk concerns me. I don't think it's actually the kind of talk that we have with the American founders. They lived in a pre-Hegelian world, right? Something is either right to do or it's wrong to do, and it doesn't really matter what time it is, right? The circumstances, the situation on the ground, right? But I think, my argument is the time has gone past, right? There's no such thing as time in this question, right? That's just I don't know. I'm not sure if there's something there. Maybe someone who's sort of more philosophically astute out there can explain it to me afterwards. But there might be. We have to do what we always have to do, right? And in some sense, I think there are universalist principles in the American founding that don't have anything to do with time. George Washington says we lived at a particularly auspicious time in the 18th century, a particularly auspicious time when we had just become much more aware of our rights, and we had a more refined sense of manners, and that we had a more vivid sense of the laws of nature and of nature's God, and the benignity of divine providence, right? And because we had a good sense of divine providence with us at every time, this was an auspicious moment for the revolution. Right now, I don't think we're in an auspicious moment for a revolution, right? I just think if everything becomes chaotic, it's not going to become chaotic and then good. That's, so yeah.
Can I just say, so I'm not suggesting anything Hegelian or deterministic or anything complicated about whether time is on our side question. I only mean this. If you have an ache or a pain, one thing is to just sort of let it go and think it'll get better on its own, and very often that's the wise thing to do. We can't be hypochondriacs. On the other hand, there are certain illnesses, certain diseases that you can't afford to simply ignore, and if you ignore them, they get worse. And that requires prudential judgment. And my argument is the inclination, well, let's just hold on, maybe opportunities will arise. We should not be blind to the opposite, that delay can make things worse, that delay will only make the disease or the illness worse. And we have to be mindful that there are dangers on both sides of that equation.
Thank you so much to the panel tonight. This is a great debate and a wonderful moderated discussion. So thank you very much. My question is to Glenn primarily, I think, but I'll open it up to both of you, about your comment about political violence. And I wanted to just draw that out a little bit. A teacher of mine once said, all morality is violence. And there's something striking about that. Like, the left believes that what they're doing is right. They're willing to use force to accomplish their goals. They're going to send in tanks. They're going to send in men with guns. And in effect, that's victory, right? You can achieve political aims through force. And my question is on, to what extent do you think conservatives today have really reconciled themselves to what politics really is? It seems conservatives are overly dependent on the idea that if only we just read a speech to someone, or if only we start a school, or if only I deliver like copies of the Constitution to people, that will change the regime. And maybe the reality is just simply more fundamental than that. And do conservatives need to change their attitudes toward what politics is in order to meet the crisis of our time?
Yeah, I agree. There's a an element of the boomers or the normicons or conservatism Inc., whatever you want to call it, and it's a kind of quasi-historicist attitude. Many of you are too young to remember this guy, Francis Fukuyama, but we've reached the end of history. Liberal democracy is here to stay, and to challenge it or to think that basic politics, politics in which people fight over questions of justice, we're past that, and it's reckless to talk about that. And I think that's taking a holiday from reality. But there are quite a few of people who are indulging in that delusion.
I guess again, I'm very sympathetic, and but I do think that we shouldn't de-glamorize starting schools. Sorry. Because while, yes, there is physical force in the sense of weapons, there's also physical force in the sense of money, right? Hashtag defund the universities, right? Withdraw funding and students from the public school systems, right? You can fight with money, right, as well as with guns. And I think we need to do a lot there. But when there was a certain point when everybody's talking about, how terrifying, the Trumper crowd is, and I was thinking, since I'm really big on defunding our universities, I know the wonderful thing about defunding the universities, it wouldn't defund you, Hillsdale, right? Because you're sort of not federally funded, so you'd be fine, right? So I can say this here, But the reality is I would lose my job. So I remember thinking at one point that if the Trumpers got violent, if the Trumpers decided to pick up their weapons and decided to, line up all of the radical left-wing ideologues who are indoctrinating our children and shooting them up with hormones, and decided to just, eliminate them in mass execution, that, when I took one of those bullets as a university professor, that would be a sort of very, very well spent death, to be that I would take it, right? I'd take one for the team, that's fine. Would I be as willing to lose my job as I am to lose my life? Well, no, I'm not so sure, actually, right? So the economic motivation sometimes is even more vital for people. So keep in mind that weapon, right? Yep.
Before we move to closing statements, I actually have a question, and that is for both of you. I think one of the key points of disagreement is maybe even as you agree that the federal government and the federal bureaucracy is not what the founders envisioned, a departure from principles of natural right and natural justice, that maybe the question of how much time or how able are we to maneuver as conservatives rests on how powerful you think that machine is and whether or not it can totally destroy us. Because it sounds like, Dr. Hanssen, what you're perhaps getting at is the Trump phenomenon shows that the people have rejected this machine, and now it's trying to bite back and claw back the lost legitimacy or the faux legitimacy that it once claimed to possess through crackdowns. Whereas Glenn, it sounds like there's not as much that we can do about it because it's actually so powerful that it has completely ruined the regime. I'm wondering if you could both speak to that and how conservatives should approach a federal bureaucracy that is potentially totalitarian.
Yeah. So here's another optimistic note, which is, there's a lot of incompetence in the ruling class too, and we shouldn't discount that. I made a joke in my opening remarks. The FBI went to catch this guy who, in 2 years since January 6th, has been living peacefully at home, and yet, of course, this huge SWAT team has to go. And the guy ran out the back door of his house, right? Oh, well, we got to get a tank now because no one would have expected him to run out the back door. We see, growing problems of incompetence in our infrastructure. I worry more about flying now than I did 20 years ago because I think there's growing incompetence thanks to the pushing of equity and all sorts of, quota and social justice demands. And so there are real dangers of the left's expansion and trying to control everything matched with their incompetence. And so that's on the other hand, there's also the ideological element. As crazy as it gets, the left continues to spread and grow. Its ideological tentacles now reach everywhere. And it seems like the crazier they get, the longer those tentacles grow, which is a very strange thing and hard to understand. And so there's encouraging and discouraging elements to me.
So you ended your question with the, what do we do in a regime that is potentially totalitarian? And so I wanted to take that and go back to the previous gentleman's question, which is keep talking until they shut you down. Keep talking until they shut you up, right? Keep your school going until they completely pull funding from it or whatever. Like, if it's totalitarian, then you just have to survive for as long as you can survive, right? I mean, this is what we learn from reading Solzhenitsyn. I mean, watch, Within the Whirlwind, just extraordinary, right? But that means in every situation, no self-censorship. In every situation. That's the only way we test to see just how totalitarian is, and we put the onus of violence on their side, right? If we use words, we put the burden of violence on their side so that people can see that it's violence, right? We have to expose totalitarianism for what it is. But if we shut up, if we self-censor, right, then we haven't even tested whether we have those freedoms anymore.
Thanks. If there are no other questions from the audience, should we move to closing statements?
Glenn, you went first. Maybe Susan, you can go this time.
Oh, thanks. I do have something prepared, but it's on my phone, and I feel embarrassed to pull out a phone. So I think I'll just go back to the idea that a patriot has to be a conservative, and that patriotism is a virtue. Right? We are not lone individuals in the state of nature. We were born out of communities, and we owe to those communities constitutive parts of ourselves. We owe to our mother and to our father, and everyone has to have a mother and a father, even if they were conceived in a petri dish from an egg bank and a sperm donor. You still have to have a mother and a father. Everyone has a mother and a father, which connects them to the entire human race. We were born out of a family. If we can strengthen those family ties, right, we are creating rootedness for ourselves and for those around us. We're rooting ourselves in them and allowing them to be rooted in us. But just as surely as we have a mother and a father, we have a place and a time. And just as we didn't choose our mother and our father, we didn't choose our time and our place. We have to fight the battle from where we are and at the time that we're in. I was born in 1970s Chicago. I know what electoral fraud looks like. I wish I was a shepherdess in 17th century France, right? That's just not an option for me, right? We have to be loyal to the time and place that we're in, right? And to those who came before us, and for all their faults, for all their blindnesses, nevertheless passed on to us principles that enabled us to recognize the situation that we now find ourselves in. So I think that piety, pietas, gratitude, loyalty, patriotism, and conservatism is not a rhetorical stance, but a moral stance that is appropriate to our human nature.
Thank you again to Susan and Khalil and Tom and Hillsdale for putting this event together. Just a couple points of clarification. I'm not in favor of indiscriminately burning down America or anything else. I would make a distinction between the institutions, which I think are in a very bad way, and the principles. The principles of the founding, especially as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, remain true. I remain very loyal to those. And it's the principles that I want to recover, and it's the current arrangement of the institutions that stand in the way. So, in fact, I don't see myself as opposing America. I want to save America, but I want to save America on the basis of its founding principles, which means radically overturning the corrupt institutions we have now. I'll end just on one optimistic point. We're in Hillsdale. I don't know how many of you have ever heard Larry Arnn, who I've known for a long time, who's a friend of mine, give his wonderful talk about Churchill in May of 1940 and how bleak it looked, and Churchill's tremendous speech before the War Cabinet, which inspired them and inspirited them to resist the Nazi menace. Larry and I are both students of Harry Jaffa, and one of the best things I ever learned from Jaffa, which I always mention on occasions like this, is that despair is both a philosophical error and a sin. It's a sin because it assumes we've been abandoned by God, and it's a philosophical error because it assumes that history is determined. But those of us who are not Hegelians reject the idea that history is determined, and that means there's always room for human freedom. And so it's always our obligation to act virtuously and act nobly and hope that chance or providence or God may intervene and the cause of human freedom is never lost.